194 against 354. The National Assembly has not approved. 194 for, 264 against. The Prime Minister must now tender his resignation to the President.
What happens when the empire that once drew borders in Africa can't even draw a budget line at home? What happens when the same France that sent troops to silence African voices now finds its own streets roaring louder than cannon fire? A government has fallen, a president is cornered, and the whispers in Paris all trace back to the one place France never expected: Africa. But if you think this collapse was just about numbers on a page, you're not ready for the truth. Let's get into it. For years, France has wrapped itself in the myth of stability. From the Élysée Palace to the polished halls of the Assemblée Nationale, the French elite cultivated the image of a nation immune to the kind of turbulence it often associated with others. France was supposed to be the model, a place where governments might shuffle, but where the system itself never buckled. Yet on September 9, 2025, the mask slipped. Prime Minister François Bayrou's government collapsed after losing a confidence vote on his austerity-driven budget. The headlines framed it as a technical defeat: 44 billion euros in cuts, too much for a fragmented assembly to swallow. But to reduce this collapse to parliamentary arithmetic is to miss the deeper fracture, the rot that has been corroding France's self-image for years. Because let's be honest, Bayrou didn't fall simply because a few lawmakers refused to back his math. He fell because the ground beneath French politics has been hollowed out. France's debt hovers near 114% of GDP, its deficit is twice the EU's limit, and its government machinery has been limping from one prime minister to the next. Bayrou was Macron's fourth appointment in just over a year, his fifth since 2023. That's not stability, that's a carousel. And a carousel is dizzying to watch, but it goes nowhere. When a country reaches the point where no government can survive a single budget season, what does that say about its strength? The bitter truth is that the collapse of Bayrou's government was less an accident and more the inevitable snap of an overstrained system. It exposed how fragile the French Republic has become, how dependent it is on appearances, how allergic it is to facing decline. And this fragility isn't confined to numbers in a budget spreadsheet. It is tied to a loss of credibility far beyond the borders of France, in places where Paris once ruled unchallenged. But before we jump ahead, let's pause on the symbolism of the fall itself. The French state, long fond of wagging its finger at Africa for supposed instability, has now been forced to face its own. When Mali or Burkina Faso changes leaders under pressure, Western analysts shake their heads about failed democracies. But when Paris topples its own prime ministers like dominoes, the establishment calls it democratic turnover. The hypocrisy reeks. What we are witnessing is not just a failed budget, but the erosion of France's ability to pretend it is the steady hand guiding others. The timing couldn't be worse for Macron. The protests filling the streets, the strikes crippling services, the bickering parties tearing the assembly apart. All of it feeds into an image of a nation incapable of steering itself. The world is watching, and the cracks are impossible to plaster over. France's political implosion is not just an internal crisis, it is a performance broadcast to every capital that once bowed to French influence. The message is clear: Paris cannot even command itself, so why should anyone else take its commands seriously? This is where the African connection begins to haunt the story. For decades, France propped up its image of stability through its dominance in Africa. The presence of bases in Mali or Niger, the grip of Francophonie, the extraction of resources, all of it created the illusion of a global power. But as those ties unravel, the French state finds itself exposed, stripped of its borrowed legitimacy. The fall of Bayrou is not the consequence of Africa's rebellion, but the two are connected like mirror images. Paris losing at home and losing abroad, both at once. So here's the question that lingers like smoke after a fire. If France can no longer convince its own people that it is stable, how can it possibly convince Africa that it remains relevant? For centuries, French leaders believed their power at home was strengthened by their power abroad. Africa was their proof of relevance. Troops stationed in dusty outposts, presidents paraded through Paris for photo opportunities, currencies still tied to the French treasury. But what happens when the subjects decide they are no longer subjects? The answer is the slow, deliberate unraveling of French dominance, a divorce long in the making, but final enough to sting. This wasn't an impulsive break, not a sudden tantrum by African governments. It was a cold, calculated strategy. Mali was the first to slam the door, demanding the withdrawal of French forces in 2022 after years of tension. Burkina Faso followed, booting out French troops in 2023 and reclaiming sovereignty over its security. Niger took it further, expelling diplomats, severing military ties, and in March 2025, quitting the Francophonie altogether. Chad, the country Paris thought it could never lose, tore up its defense pact in 2024, sending shockwaves through France's entire Sahel policy. Each move wasn't just a rejection, it was humiliation. For every plane lifting French soldiers out of Africa, another piece of France's myth of global relevance evaporated. What makes this African divorce unique is that it wasn't reactive. It wasn't about who sat in the Élysée Palace or what party ruled the Assemblée Nationale. It was about Africa asserting itself on its own terms. Leaders like Ibrahim Traoré in Burkina Faso and Assimi Goïta in Mali didn't just expel the French, they openly mocked Paris's pretensions, declaring they would not be lectured by a power that could not even feed its own stability. The symbolism cut deeper than any policy paper. Africa was saying, "Your house is falling apart, don't come to rearrange ours." And Africa didn't just walk away into silence, it pivoted. New partnerships emerged with Russia, with China, with regional alliances like the Alliance of Sahel States. The old dependency was shattered. French troops gone? Fine. Russian advisors arrived. French aid suspended? African nations turned to one another, pooling resources and building new pipelines of cooperation. The departure of France didn't leave a void. It left space for something stronger, something that no longer revolved around Paris. For France, the most painful part is not just losing access to military bases or diplomatic leverage. It is losing the illusion that Africa needs it. The truth is now unavoidable. Africa is standing, even rising, without the so-called stabilizing hand of Paris. This truth gnaws at the French establishment because, for decades, their domestic legitimacy was reinforced by their global projection of power. When a French prime minister visited Bamako or Niamey, it was broadcast in Paris as proof of relevance, as evidence that France was still a global force. Strip that away, and suddenly the domestic rot is visible for all to see. And here lies the uncomfortable symmetry. As Beirut's government fell to pieces in the assembly, Africa was busy dismantling the scaffolding that once held up France's global image. Both collapses, domestic and foreign, mirror each other. France no longer commands obedience abroad, just as it can no longer command confidence at home. So the question arises, what did Emmanuel Macron do while this African divorce was unfolding? Did he confront the reality of shrinking influence, or did he double down on denial, clinging to the fantasy of an empire that no longer exists? Let's pause for a second to say big thank you to the Black Culture Diary community, where Black voices, stories, and legacies are preserved and amplified. By becoming a member, you're not just supporting the channel, you're becoming part of a powerful cultural movement. Let's continue. Macron chose denial. He dressed up the retreat as strategic redeployment, pretending the end of French troops in Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger, and Chad was simply part of a new global vision. He spoke of reshaping partnerships, as though France were still the one dictating terms. But everyone could see it. The emperor was naked. France wasn't redeploying, it was retreating. The empire had shrunk, yet Macron acted like nothing had changed. And therein lies the tragedy of France today. A leadership trapped in fantasy, selling the public an empire that only exists on paper. The absurdity of Macron's posturing is that he demanded sacrifices at home while projecting illusions abroad. Bayrou's doomed budget, 44 billion euros in cuts, higher taxes, frozen pensions, was supposed to prove France's seriousness to markets in Brussels. Yet at the very same time, Macron insisted France was still a global power, investing resources in diplomacy that yielded no victories. To the French worker in Marseille or Lyon, this contradiction was obvious. Why must they tighten belts when the state keeps pretending it can police the world? Macron's empire building was not made of marble or steel. It was made of speeches and illusions. It was quite literally an empire of sand. And like sand, it slipped through his fingers. Without Africa to anchor its image, France had no stage left to perform its strength. The Sahel used to be sold to French citizens as proof of Paris's ability to lead, to stabilize, to civilize. Macron could once point to French convoys in Niamey or Ouagadougou as evidence that Paris still mattered. But when those convoys packed up and left, what remained? Empty rhetoric. Macron was forced to repackage defeat as a strategy, but his people weren't fooled. The Assemblée Nationale's rejection of Bayrou's budget wasn't just a matter of fiscal numbers. It was a vote against the hypocrisy of a government claiming grandeur while delivering decline. And here's where the bitterness deepens. Macron's empire of sand not only fooled no one, but it actively worsened France's internal crisis. Instead of facing the fact that Africa was gone, he used the illusion of continued global power to justify austerity. The logic went like this. France must cut spending now to keep its status abroad tomorrow. But status abroad was already evaporating, so the cuts became pain without purpose. Workers lost, pensioners lost, families lost, yet the promised reward of a great France never arrived. The government fell because people realized they were sacrificing for a fantasy. The cruel irony is that Macron, the man who once presented himself as Europe's visionary, ended up behaving like a desperate gambler. Every African rejection, every military withdrawal, every diplomatic humiliation should have been a wake-up call. Instead, he doubled down, pretending Paris still held the cards. He thought he could bluff Africa, bluff Europe, and even bluff his own citizens. But when the cards hit the table, it was obvious. France was playing a losing hand, and that loss didn't stay confined to the halls of Parliament. It spilled outward, into the streets of Paris and Marseille, into strikes and protests that rattled the Fifth Republic. Macron's empire of sand had consequences. When leaders deny reality long enough, reality doesn't politely wait. It crashes the party. And when it did, it brought chaos not just in the assembly, but in the boulevards. Which leaves us with the next question. If the illusion of empire collapsed inside Parliament, how did it echo through the streets of France itself? Here's a reminder to please like and share the video and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on Black culture, history, civilization, and identity. Let's continue now. When illusions collapse in the assembly, they don't stay confined to marble chambers. They spill outward into the streets where ordinary people bear the cost of political fantasy. And that is exactly what happened in France after Bayrou's fall. Macron's empire of sand wasn't just an abstract humiliation, it had consequences that ordinary French workers could feel in their wallets, in their pensions, in their daily grind. The budget collapse was the spark, but the anger in the streets was the fire. And what a fire it was. Marches swelling across Paris, unions grinding transport to a halt, teachers and health workers demanding to know why they should pay the price for a government that had lost everything abroad. This is the cruel twist. France once portrayed itself as Africa's instructor in democracy, telling African nations that protests were signs of weakness and instability. Yet here was France itself, looking like the very caricature it used to mock. Tear gas clouding the boulevards, riot police charging demonstrators, and the government scrambling to spin chaos as order under pressure. To African eyes, the irony was delicious. The same state that dispatched troops to Bamako in the name of stability couldn't even keep its own capital steady. It was as if Africa's rejection of French dominance had planted a mirror in the middle of Paris, forcing France to see itself as it truly was, fragile, divided, and stripped of its swagger. And what exactly were people protesting? On the surface, it was pensions, wages, and austerity. But deeper down, it was the betrayal of a promise. For decades, French leaders told their citizens that the sacrifices of the empire, foreign deployments, overseas aid, and military adventures were justified because they secured France's place as a global power. If the empire thrives, the nation thrives. But when the empire crumbled, what remained was only the cost, without the benefit. Workers were being told to give up more, not for victory, but for vanity. That betrayal fueled the fury in the streets. The connection to Africa runs deeper than symbolism. France's African debacle had material consequences: lost military contracts, diminished resource access, and the evaporation of diplomatic leverage. These losses translated into economic strain at home, and the government tried to plug the holes with austerity. The French people, even if they didn't phrase it in geopolitical terms, felt the impact in their bones. They knew they were paying for failures they didn't choose. They might not chant about Mali or Niger during their protests, but the shadow of those losses hung over every march. The fall of Beirut's budget was not just domestic arithmetic, it was Africa echoing back into Paris. And let's not miss the poetic justice. For decades, France dictated terms to Africa with an air of superiority. Now, the French people themselves are dictating terms to their government. We will not accept this anymore. It is a reversal of roles, one that lays bare the hypocrisy of Paris. If France cannot control the fury of its own citizens, on what moral ground can it ever claim to control, lecture, or discipline other people? The empire is not just gone, its pretense has been shattered. Yet the story doesn't end with protests alone. The bigger question now looms: if the government collapses in the assembly and the people revolt in the streets, then who truly holds the reins of France? Who controls a nation that can't command obedience abroad or at home? That is the haunting question hanging over Paris today. And the bitter answer is that no one truly governs. France has become a nation in limbo, stuck between the arrogance of its past and the uncertainty of its future. Its leaders stumble from one crisis to another, its assemblies topple prime ministers in rapid succession, and its streets are restless with discontent. In such chaos, the old illusion of control has evaporated. And while France shrinks, Africa is doing something Paris never expected. It is rising. This reversal of roles is not a coincidence. It is a consequence. For decades, France derived its legitimacy at home from its dominance abroad. The images of French troops parading through African capitals, the symbols of Francophonie, the control of the CFA franc, all of it gave the illusion that Paris mattered. When those props disappeared, the stage collapsed. But Africa did not simply walk away. It filled the vacuum with action. New alliances, new trade corridors, new industries, these became the pillars of a rising continent. Where France once extended its power, Africa now extends its own. Look at the contrasts. France is mired in austerity, begging its citizens to accept less. Africa, meanwhile, is investing in more refineries, more processing plants, more infrastructure. In Burkina Faso, a gold refinery capable of producing hundreds of kilograms a day is no longer a dream. It is operational. In Niger, rejecting Francophonie was not a symbolic tantrum but part of a deliberate turn toward sovereignty, away from colonial currencies and institutions. In Mali, national projects are being built with new partners, outside the shadow of Paris. Every step Africa takes toward independence exposes another crack in France's shrinking frame. And here is where the irony becomes unbearable for Paris. The very narrative it once sold about Africa, that the continent was dependent, unstable, and incapable, has now boomeranged back. France is the one unable to keep governments alive, the one facing waves of protest, the one losing influence day by day. Africa is the one moving forward, reshaping its destiny. What France mocked in others has become its own reflection. The student has surpassed the teacher, and the teacher is exposed as a fraud. The bitter analyst must ask, can France recover? The honest answer is no, not in the old way. France can no longer pretend to be Africa's master. It can no longer hold the Sahel as its private chessboard or dictate currencies and treaties. Its domestic crises are too deep, its global leverage too thin. At best, it may reinvent itself as a mid-tier European power, relevant within Brussels but irrelevant beyond. But the age of France as a world power is gone, and Africa helped bury it. For Africa, this moment is more than symbolic. It is liberating. It proves that saying no to Paris is not the end of the road, but the beginning of a new one. Each African nation that rejects French bases or institutions is not stepping into a void, but stepping into its own sovereignty. The continent is not waiting for France to stabilize, it is building its own stability, on its own terms. And that is the greatest humiliation for Paris. It was not Africa's collapse that defined this era, but Africa's rise. So, When historians look back on Beirut's fall in September 2025, they will not see a budgetary hiccup. They will see the political unraveling of a state that once believed it could dictate to others while failing to command itself. They will see the echoes of Africa's defiance reverberating through French boulevards. And they will see, most of all, the end of a cycle. France shrinking into crisis, Africa stepping into power. The story ends with a simple truth, one that Paris has long tried to ignore. Africa does not need France. But France, stripped of its illusions and staggering in crisis, may just need Africa. And that, more than any no-confidence vote or protest march, is the final insult of history. How powerful is a president who can't even keep a prime minister in office? Let us know in the comment section what's left of France's pride when Africa no longer listens. Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If so, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We have decided to bring videos on something nobody talks about: the Black culture, civilization, history, and evidence about how glorious Blacks have been. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.